Hey there, welcome you all to this Aftereffects expression tutorial series. This chapter covers one easy topic, commands, sandwiched between two more complex topics, variables and dimensions. For the complex topics, we will need to touch on some math, or at least numbers. Don't fret, you'll only dip your toes, you won't get your hair wet. And I also promise to hold your hand through the whole process and to go slowly. I flunked math in high school. I'm not proud of the fact, but I feel saying that if I can handle the math in this chapter, you can handle it too. It doesn't go beyond basic arithmetic. Why bother with all this stuff? Because you need to understand it in order to move beyond simple pick-whip based expressions. So if you bear with me through this chapter, which I hope you will also enjoy, you will pop out the other end much more confident about expressions, and you will be able to use this chapter's concept to craft some real cool visual effects. Now, what is variables? Perhaps you recall variables from high school math, and perhaps you get a queasy feeling when you think about them. Don't worry, we are not going to use them for anything complicated, but we do need to revisit them. As you may remember, or as you may not, variables are letters that stand in for numbers. As in this problem, x is equal to 4, x plus 1 is a question mark, and answer is 5. Variables are called variables because they can change what they stand for. They vary. In that problem, x means 4, but in this problem, it means 37. In traditional math, variables are always letters x, y, a, b, c, and so on. But most JavaScript programmers frown on using letters. They prefer words. If JavaScript programmers taught math, they would have written the problem like this. And if they had 10 apples and 6 oranges, and they wanted how much total fruit they had, they would have written the problem like this. Oh boy, I wish my math teacher had used these words instead of letters. If we would have used JavaScript back in school, we would have written the last problem like this. Notice the semicolons? In JavaScript, semicolon mean the same thing that periods mean in English. In English, we see that period marks the end of a sentence. In JavaScript, we say that semicolon marks the end of a statement. So all this time when we have been writing expressions like transform.opacity, we could have written them with a semicolon. But you don't have to include semicolons when your expression is only one line long. However, you must include them when your expression is more than one line long. For instance, check this out. Don't worry about what the expression means or does, but notice that it contains two statements. I typed each statement on its own line, pressing the return or enter key after the first statement. As you will see, you don't have to type each statement on its own line, but doing so makes multiline expressions easier to read, so I recommend doing it. The key thing here is that the first statement ends with a semicolon, without which After Effects wouldn't understand that the first statement was over and that a new statement was following. This is yet another way in which expressions interpreter is literal minded. In English, I could get away with writing, "I'm thirsty, give me some water," without a period between the two sentences. English teachers would complain, but at least everyone would know what I meant. This sort of thing won't work in JavaScript. You must end each statement with a semicolon, except for the final one. Notice my second and final line doesn't end up with a semicolon. Because it's the last line, the interpreter doesn't need a separator to tell it when that line ends and the next one begins. There is no next one. However, it's legal to add a semicolon to the last line if you want to. In the upcoming lessons, I will generally omit semicolons on final lines. Also, I'll type each statement on its own line. Fine. Now, what the heck does it mean? Where the first statement creates a variable called controller. To create a variable, you just make up with a word and use it. I could have used these two, but I choose controller because I thought it better described the point of making a variable in the first place. The variable is going to control the expression. Next, I gave the variable a meaning in this expression. Controller means transform.opacity, the value of the opacity property in the timeline group. So if opacity happens to be 50 right now, controller is 50 right now. If I change opacity to 100, controller will be 100. Controller is equal to whatever opacity is equal to. Confusing? Well, let me explain more. I like to think of variables as cardboard boxes in the attic. By typing controller is equal to transform.opacity, I am putting a box inside the attic and writing controller on its magic marker. Then I am sticking the value of the opacity in the box. If I later want the value of the opacity, as I do on the second line of expression, I can go back to the box and get it. Just as if I later want some socks that I have put it in a box. I'll find them in the box labeled socks. But in reality, variables are little chunks of RAM. RAM is temporary because it is erased when you turn off your computer or stop running a program. Creating a variable is like saying, hey computer, store the value of transform.opacity in a little chunk of RAM and label that chunk controller. And when I want to know the value of transform.opacity, I'll just say controller, and when I say that, tell me what's stored in the chunk of RAM with that name. To explain more in detail, the random access part means that the computer can access any value stored in memory without starting with the first item, moving to the second, then the third, then the fourth, and so on, until it finds the item it is looking for. Instead, it can jump right to what it wants and access it. The opposite of random access is sequential access. If you're looking for a Stephen King novel on your bookshelf, you can randomly access it, meaning you can jump right to the novel. If you had to sequentially access it, you'd have to start with first book, check the title, move on to the next one, then the next, and so on until you find the book you are looking for, at which point you would be so worn out you'd be probably just turn on the TV. Now back to expressions. The last statement of an expression is the most important one. It's the line that After Effects will use to control the property to which you apply the expression. Only the second statement, controller, will control the rotation. Let's say I omit it. Controller is equal to transform.opacity. That's just telling the computer to store a value in a variable. Okay, it will, but so what? It's like asking an literally friend to pick a number between 1 and 10. She says okay and then just stares at you. Why didn't she do anything? She did do something. She picked a number between 1 and 10 in her mind. You didn't ask her to tell you the number, so she didn't. Now let us look at the English translation of this expression. Controller is equal to transform.opacity. The translation is store the value of opacity in a box labeled controller. Now look at the second statement. The translation here is set the value of this property, which is rotation, to whatever is stored in the box labeled controller. Now I'll be the first to admit that this is a silly expression. You could have eliminated the variable and just typed or picked with transform.opacity as we did in lesson 1. My point wasn't to show you anything useful. It was to explain a bit about how variables work, but we will get to useful shortly enough. Before we do, here are a few more grammatical rules about variables. Number 1, they can't contain spaces. So this is wrong. If I want to simulate spaces, I can use either these two options, the one with underscores and with camel case letters. If you are using camel case, it's traditional to start with the first letter with the lowercase letter, as I did with my, and all subsequent words with uppercase letters, as I did with age, in. You may also use numbers and variables, but variables can't start with a number. And the only symbols you can use besides letters and numbers are underscores and dollar signs. Now let's get into reserved words. Words that are part of the expressions language are called reserved words, and you should never use them as a variable name. If you do, After Effects won't necessarily display an error. Instead, your expression will just behave in some odd, unpredictable way. Reserved words include the following like abstract, as, boolean, break, byte. I'll write all the reserved words in the description below. Those are the standard JavaScript reserved words, meaning you shouldn't use them as a variable names in any system that uses the language like web browsers, Flash, etc. In addition to those words, After Effects users should avoid naming variables after words that stand for comp and layer properties. For instance, you should never name a variable position. You can see the complete list of special After Effects reserved words in the expression language menu, which is here. I hope you enjoyed about our learning about variables and its rules. Now in next lesson we are going to look about the useful expressions in variables. If you haven't subscribed this channel, please subscribe to it and click the bell notification icon next to it. See you in next lesson. Ta-ta.